My sister cut the brake line on my car the morning I was taking my daughter to court to escape my family forever. As my vehicle slammed into the guardrail, my mother pulled up in her luxury sedan, rolled down her window, and smiled. She told me I would never leave them alive unless I surrendered my child. They had no idea what was coming. I am Caroline, 33 years old, and a forensic accountant who spent the last 3 years quietly preparing for this exact moment. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to fight back against a toxic family who tried to destroy everything you love. The morning of the final custody hearing, the air inside my SUV was thick with tension. My 8-year-old daughter Lily sat in the back seat clutching the stuffed bear her father David had given her before he died. I checked the rearview mirror, my hands gripping the steering wheel. We were 10 minutes away from the downtown family courthouse. 10 minutes from legally severing ties with my parents and my sister Monica. As we approached the steep incline of the Elm Street intersection, the traffic light turned red. I pressed my foot against the brake pedal. It went straight to the floorboard with zero resistance. Panic shot through my chest. I pumped the pedal again. Nothing. We were hurtling toward a busy intersection at 50 miles per hour. "Hold on tight, Lily," I shouted, my professional instincts kicking in. I slammed my hand onto the emergency brake lever and jerked the steering wheel hard to the right. The tires screamed against the asphalt. The SUV spun wildly, throwing us sideways before slamming violently into the solid steel guardrail. The airbags deployed with a deafening crack, filling the cabin with white powder and the sharp smell of burnt rubber. I coughed, waving the smoke away, my heart pounding against my ribs. I turned frantically to the back seat. Lily was crying, terrified but physically unharmed. Before the ringing in my ears could even fade, a pristine silver Lexus slowly pulled up right beside the smoking wreckage of my car. The tinted passenger window glided down smoothly. My mother, Beatrice, sat in the passenger seat dressed impeccably in a designer suit, her hair perfectly styled for a court appearance. Next to her in the driver's seat was Monica, my younger sister, wearing a smug and deeply satisfied smirk. Beatrice peered over her expensive sunglasses at the crushed front end of my car. "Just like you ruined David's life, you are ruining Lily's," she said, her voice dripping with artificial pity. "You are a danger to yourself and that child, Caroline. Sign the custody papers over to Monica today, or you will never leave this family alive." The sheer audacity of her threat hung in the cold morning air. They had orchestrated this crash. They wanted me dead, or at the very least deemed an unfit and reckless mother right before the judge made his ruling. They needed Lily, or more specifically, they needed the $10 million trust fund David had left solely to her. I did not cry. I did not beg. I unbuckled my seatbelt, kicked my jammed door with both feet until the metal shrieked and gave way, and stepped out onto the shattered glass. I wiped a stream of blood from my split lip and walked straight up to their pristine Lexus. "You think I do not know? Monica stole my spare keys last night during your uninvited ambush at my house," I said, leaning down so I was inches from my mother's face. "Just like she stole Grandma's diamond necklace when I was 16, and you forced me to take the fall to protect your precious golden child." Monica's smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a flash of genuine alarm. "You are crazy," Monica snapped, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "The police will see this as reckless driving. You are going to lose custody today. Caroline and my husband is going to make sure of it." I grabbed the edge of their window frame. "I am a forensic accountant, Monica. I trace digital footprints and physical assets for a living. You really think I do not have a hidden camera aimed directly at my driveway? I saw you sliding under my chassis at 3 in the morning with wire cutters." Beatrice scoffed, attempting to maintain her aristocratic composure despite the sudden shift in power. "A camera will not save you in court, Caroline. Look at you. You look like a deranged addict. Terrence is already at the courthouse preparing the filings. He has built an airtight case against you." Hearing my brother-in-law's name made my blood boil. Terrence was a brilliant assistant district attorney, a man of profound integrity who had worked his way up from nothing. As an African American man navigating a ruthless legal system, he had built a flawless reputation. My family only approved of Monica marrying him because his prestigious title bought them immense social capital. Now they were using his brilliant legal mind to destroy me, feeding him fabricated evidence to paint me as an unfit mother. Terrence only believes you because he does not know the monsters you truly are, I shot back. But he is about to find out exactly what kind of people he married into. Beatrice rolled her eyes, adjusting her diamond earrings. You always were prone to hysterics. We will see you inside if you can even find a ride. Monica, roll up the window. The glass slid up, nearly catching my fingers, and the Lexus sped off toward the courthouse, leaving me bleeding by the side of the road. I reached into the back seat and unbuckled my sobbing daughter. I got you, baby, I whispered, pulling her tight against my chest. We are not giving up. I pulled my phone from my pocket. The screen was cracked, but it still worked. I bypassed the rideshare applications and opened a private security portal. 3 days ago, anticipating my family's lethal desperation and my father Richard's looming bankruptcy, I had retained a private armored transport service for this exact route. I hit the emergency dispatch button. Within 3 minutes, a massive black tactical SUV rounded the corner and pulled up to the curb. The heavy doors unlocked with a solid click. I breathed a huge sigh of relief, sheltering Lily from the morning chill as we hurried toward the back seat. But as I opened the heavy passenger door, the driver slowly turned around to face me. The blood completely drained from my face. It was not the armed security contractor I had hired. Sitting in the driver's seat, wearing a mocking and predatory grin, was my father Richard. The heavy steel door of the armored SUV clicked shut behind me. The locks engaged with a solid, definitive thud that echoed in the quiet cabin. I looked at the driver, expecting to see the broad shoulders of the private security contractor I had paid a premium for. Instead, the man sitting behind the wheel turned around, adjusting the cuffs of his custom Italian suit. "Hello, Caroline, my father," Richard said, flashing a smile that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. My breath caught in my throat. I pulled the door handle, but it was completely dead. The child locks were engaged. I was trapped in the back seat of a reinforced steel cage with my 8-year-old daughter. Lily shrank against my side, burying her face into my coat. "What are you doing here, Dad?" I demanded, keeping my voice dangerously level. "Where is my driver?" Richard chuckled, turning back to face the windshield as he shifted the massive vehicle into drive. "Your driver was remarkably easy to deal with, Caroline. He took $5,000 in cash to walk away and hand me the keys. You always were naive with money. You think a few $1,000s buys loyalty in this city? Loyalty belongs to those who write the biggest checks." He accelerated, pulling the SUV away from the wreckage of my crashed car. I grabbed the heavy partition behind his seat, my knuckles turning white. "Let us out right now," I ordered. "You are kidnapping us. This is a federal offense." "Do not be dramatic," he sighed, checking his rearview mirror. "I am simply giving my daughter and granddaughter a ride to the courthouse. We have a very important family meeting with the judge today. You are going to walk into that courtroom. You are going to tell the judge that your grief over David's death has driven you to substance abuse, and you are going to sign full custody of Lily over to Monica." I stared at the back of his perfectly groomed head, the sheer depravity of his words washing over me. This was never about my mental health. This was never about what was best for Lily. This is about the trust fund, I said, the pieces snapping together with terrifying clarity. David's $10 million. You do not want custody of Lily. You want control of her accounts. Richard gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles strained against the leather. Your husband was a street rat who got lucky with a few tech patents. He never respected this family. He refused to invest in my commercial real estate ventures when he was alive, disrespecting the very people who gave him a place in high society. That $10 million is compensation, Caroline. It belongs to this family, not to a dead man's 8-year-old piggy bank. And it certainly does not belong to a screw-up like you. He was sweating. I could see the sheen of moisture on the back of his neck. My father, the supposedly untouchable titan of Boston real estate, was sweating like a man with a gun to his head. "You are bankrupt," I realized aloud, reading the desperate tension in his shoulders. I ran the forensic audits on your shell companies last month, Dad. You are drowning in debt. You are not trying to maintain a legacy. You are trying to steal your granddaughter's inheritance to keep yourself out of federal prison. Shut your mouth! Richard snapped, his voice cracking with sudden violent rage. He slammed his hand against the steering wheel. You know nothing about the pressures of my world. You will do exactly as you are told today. Once Monica has custody, the court will appoint me as the financial conservator of the estate. The paperwork is already drawn up. All you have to do is surrender. We were approaching the highway on-ramp. If he merged onto the interstate, my options for escape would vanish. The armored doors were too heavy to kick open, and the reinforced glass was designed to withstand ballistic impact from the outside. But my father, in his arrogant desperation, had forgotten one crucial detail about who I was. I was a forensic accountant. My entire career was built on finding the hidden flaws in seemingly impenetrable systems. And I never ever walked into a hostile environment without a contingency plan. I reached deep into the bottom of my leather tote bag, my fingers bypassing my wallet and files until they wrapped around a solid, heavy steel handle. I had purchased a tactical emergency glass-breaking hammer 3 years ago, the day after David died in a car crash that my family had quickly written off as a tragic accident. I had promised myself I would never be trapped inside a vehicle again. Cover your eyes and tuck your head down, baby, I whispered to Lily, shielding her small body with my coat. What are you whispering about back there? Richard demanded, glancing suspiciously at the rearview mirror. I said, sit back and prepare yourself for court. I did not answer him. I gripped the heavy steel hammer, flipped it, to expose the tungsten carbide tip, and swung it backward with every ounce of strength I possessed. I drove the metal spike directly into the bottom corner of the passenger window. Armored glass is designed to repel blunt force from the exterior, but a concentrated pinpoint strike to the interior edge exploits the tension of the tempered layers. A loud, deafening crack echoed through the cabin. The window did not shatter into dangerous shards, but rather spider-webbed, completely turning into a sheet of opaque, fractured white. "What the hell are you doing?" Richard screamed, slamming on the brakes in sheer panic. The heavy SUV lurched violently, tires skidding against the pavement just inches from the highway on-ramp. I swung the hammer a second time, smashing it directly into the center of the fractured pane. The weakened glass buckled outward, bursting onto the street in a shower of thick, blunt cubes. The crisp morning wind howled through the gaping hole in the door. "Stop the car!" Richard roared, unbuckling his seatbelt and lunging toward the center partition, his face twisted in absolute fury. I shoved my arm through the broken window, bypassing the engaged child locks by grabbing the exterior handle. I yanked it hard. The heavy armored door swung open. I scooped Lily into my arms, practically diving out of the SUV and tumbling onto the hard concrete of the shoulder. I scrambled to my feet, my knees scraped and bleeding, but my grip on my daughter never loosened. Behind me, Richard was thrashing against the locked security partition of his own hijacked vehicle, unable to reach the back seat, trapped in the very cage he had intended for us. "Caroline, get back here right now," he bellowed through the broken window, his aristocratic mask completely shattered. I ignored him, sprinting toward a black sedan that had slowed down to observe the chaos. It was an Uber, the glowing decal shining brightly in the windshield. I threw open the back door and pushed Lily inside, throwing a $100 bill directly onto the center console. Family courthouse. I ordered the stunned driver, slamming the door shut behind me. "Drive, now." The driver hit the gas, speeding away from the on-ramp. I looked out the rear window, watching my father screaming on the side of the road, his fists pounding uselessly against the side of the armored SUV. We had escaped the physical trap, but as I pulled Lily close and watched the imposing marble pillars of the courthouse come into view, I knew the real war was just beginning. I wiped the blood from my lip and smoothed down my jacket. It was time to face the rest of them. The silence was absolute. I stepped inside my chest, heaving, shielding Lily behind my leg. The pristine wood-paneled room felt like a predator's den. Sitting comfortably at the plaintiff's table, looking like a flawless oil painting of aristocratic concern, were my parents. Beatrice dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes with a monogrammed silk handkerchief. Richard sat tall, projecting the somber image of a weary, heartbroken grandfather burdened by a tragic family crisis. And Monica, sitting right between them, wore a tailored conservative navy dress. Her posture exuded innocent maternal distress. They had beaten me here. They had left me to die in a rigged car on a busy highway, hijacked my rescue transport, and still managed to arrive looking like absolute saints. But my eyes did not stay on my blood relatives. They locked onto the man standing at the plaintiff's podium, neatly arranging a stack of legal folders. The air completely left my lungs. My breath hitched. Standing there, actively representing the very people who had just tried to murder me, was Terrence. Terrence was Monica's husband. He was also a brilliant, fiercely principled African-American assistant district attorney. He was a man who had built his entire career and formidable reputation on tearing down corrupt elites, prosecuting white-collar criminals, and defending the vulnerable. My parents secretly despised his working-class background and made vile comments behind closed doors. But publicly, they worshipped his title. Having a high-profile ADA in the family bought them the kind of bulletproof social credibility that their stolen money could never secure. They paraded him around at galas to mask their own financial rot. Terrence was the only truly decent human being who ever sat at our toxic family dinner table, and now he was leading the legal charge to take my daughter away from me. I marched straight down the center aisle, gripping Lily's hand tightly, and guided her to the empty defendant's table. Judge Harrison, a severe man with a reputation for zero tolerance, peered over his wire-rimmed glasses. His face twisted in visible disgust as he took in my torn clothes, bruised forehead, and frantic demeanor. "Counselor," the judge barked, addressing Terrence with a sharp tone. "Is this the mother?" "Yes, Your Honor," Terrence replied. His voice was heavy, completely lacking his usual courtroom aggression. He did not look at me with the triumphant malice my family wore so proudly. He looked at me with profound, agonizing pity. I settled Lily into the heavy wooden chair beside me and immediately opened my battered laptop. "I do not need a court-appointed lawyer." "Your Honor," I stated, forcing my voice to echo clearly across the cavernous room. "I am a certified forensic accountant, and I am representing myself today." Terrence sighed heavily, pinching the bridge of his nose as if dealing with a tragic lost cause. He requested a brief moment from the judge and walked across the aisle, stepping away from Monica and my parents. He stopped just inches from my table, positioning his broad shoulders to block the judge's view of my bruised face. He leaned down, his expensive cologne mixing with the harsh scent of my own blood and the burnt rubber still clinging to my hair. "Caroline, please," Terrence whispered, his voice cracking with genuine heartbreaking emotion. "Look at yourself. You are bleeding. You smell like smoke and chemicals. Monica told me about your relapse last night. She told me you stole Richard's car this morning and crashed it on the highway because you were high." I froze. My mind raced, instantly slotting the pieces of their horrific puzzle together. Monica had not just cut my brake lines. She had fed her husband a carefully constructed, masterful lie, painting my assassination attempt as a drug-fueled joyride. They were using my battered, erratic appearance right now to validate their story. They had played on Terrence's rigid moral compass, convincing him that stripping me of my child was an act of righteous salvation. "Go to rehab," Terrence pleaded, his eyes searching mine for any sign of the professional woman he used to respect. "Just surrender the custody papers to Monica today. I promise I will personally make sure you get the best treatment money can buy. Do not make me destroy you in front of the judge to protect this child." I stared into the eyes of a righteous man who had been weaponized by absolute evil. My family had completely brainwashed the only person capable of locking them away. Terrence reached his hand across the wooden barrier separating our tables, his expression softening into a mask of misplaced compassion. He truly believed he was saving my daughter from a monster. I stepped back instantly, pulling Lily tighter against my side. I refused to let his brainwashed sympathy weaken my resolve. Before Terrence could offer another word of poisoned comfort, the sharp, authoritative crack of a wooden gavel echoed through the room. Judge Harrison glared down from his elevated bench, his patience clearly exhausted by the morning schedule. "Take your seats immediately," The judge barked, his voice bouncing off the high mahogany walls. Mrs. Caroline Evans, you are late to a final custody hearing. You are visibly injured, covered in dirt, and what appears to be blood, and you have brought a minor child into a closed courtroom. This does not bode well for your case. Where is your legal representation? I do not have counsel, Your Honor, I replied, guiding Lily into the heavy wooden chair beside me. I opened my battered laptop, the casing cracked from the car crash, but the hard drive perfectly intact. I am a certified forensic accountant, and I will be representing myself today. The judge frowned deeply, leaning back in his leather chair with a look of supreme skepticism. Terrence buttoned his tailored suit jacket and walked back to the plaintiff table. He looked burdened, like a man forced to carry out a tragic but necessary execution. My mother Beatrice sat in the front row of the gallery, already weeping softly into a monogrammed silk handkerchief. She was playing the role of the devastated, loving grandmother flawlessly. Richard sat next to her, wrapping a comforting arm around her shoulders with practiced solemnity. Monica sat beside Terrence, looking down at her hands, the picture of a concerned sister. Your Honor, Terrence began, his deep voice filling the room with steady, practiced authority. We are here today to request an emergency transfer of custody for 8-year-old Lily Evans to her Aunt Monica. We do this not out of malice or spite, but out of absolute necessity. Caroline Evans is a severe and immediate threat to her daughter's physical and financial well-being. Terrence picked up a thick stack of glossy documents and handed a copy to the bailiff, who marched across the room and dropped it onto my table. I flipped open the first page. It was a staggering invoice from an exclusive, highly discreet rehabilitation clinic in Zurich. The total bill was over $200,000, and the name printed at the top was mine. For the past 3 years, ever since the tragic and sudden death of her husband David, Caroline has been spiraling completely out of control. Terrence continued, his tone heavy with manufactured regret. She has systematically squandered the remainder of David's life insurance payout on illegal offshore gambling syndicates. She has checked in and out of European rehab facilities under assumed names to hide her severe addiction. And now that her personal funds are depleted, she is actively attempting to liquidate the $10 million trust fund legally set up for her daughter. I flipped through the stack of papers as he spoke. The forgeries were immaculate, expensive, and deeply thorough. There were bank statements showing massive wire transfers to shell companies in Macau and Cyprus. There were digital casino markers totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars. There were even forged psychiatric evaluations detailing a hopeless gambling addiction. My family had spared absolutely no expense in fabricating a digital and paper trail that painted me as a desperate, addicted monster willing to steal from her own child. Beatrice let out a loud, theatrical sob from the gallery, ensuring the judge heard her distress. We just want to save our precious granddaughter, she cried out, clutching Richard's arm as if she might faint. We have tried so hard to help Caroline. We have given her everything, but she simply refuses to stop destroying herself. The judge looked down at me with open disgust. These are exceptionally serious allegations, Mrs. Evans. The documentary evidence presented by the assistant district attorney is overwhelming and highly detailed. A mother stealing from her child trust fund to feed a gambling habit is grounds for immediate termination of parental rights. Do you have anything to say before I sign this emergency custody order and hand your daughter over to your sister? I did not panic. I did not raise my voice or scream about being framed. I was a forensic accountant. I lived in the numbers, and numbers never lied. I stood up slowly, smoothing the wrinkles from my torn, smoke-scented jacket. I looked past the judge and locked eyes directly with Terrence. Terrence, I said, my voice steady, carrying a deadly, absolute calm. You are a brilliant assistant district attorney. You have put away cartel bosses, corrupt politicians, and white-collar criminals. You build airtight cases. But you have one massive, glaring blind spot. You trust your wife. Monica shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Her perfectly manicured hands tightened around her designer purse, her knuckles turning white. Objection, Terrence said quickly, though he looked momentarily unsettled by my directness. Personal attacks are entirely irrelevant to the financial evidence presented before the court. I tapped a rapid series of keys on my laptop. It is entirely relevant to the financial evidence I countered, keeping my gaze fixed on him. Because you are presenting digital casino markers and wire transfer requests as absolute proof of my addiction. But as a seasoned prosecutor, did you ever actually subpoena the IP addresses attached to those digital markers? Or did you just take the printed pages Monica handed you at face value? Terrence froze. The confident, commanding courtroom posture he had maintained for the last 10 minutes completely vanished. He looked down at the thick stack of papers in his hands, then slowly turned his head to look at his wife. Monica's face was rapidly losing all its color, turning a sickly pale white. Your Honor, I requested permission to connect my laptop to the court projector system. The judge, intrigued by the sudden shift in the room dynamic and Terrence's sudden silence, nodded his approval. I plugged in the video cable. A massive, heavily coded spreadsheet illuminated the large white screen behind the judge bench. I highlighted a specific column of numbers in bright, glowing red. These are the IP addresses associated with every single offshore bet, every luxury purchase, and every forged medical bill presented today. I explained, my voice ringing with absolute certainty. They do not trace back to my home. They do not trace back to my office. They trace back to a highly secure private residential router located in a gated community in Chestnut Hill. The courtroom went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. Terrence stared at the giant screen, his jaw practically hitting the floor. He recognized that IP address instantly. He paid the internet bill for it every single month. That is correct, Terrence, I said, turning to face him as the reality of his situation crashed down upon him. Every single one of those fraudulent debts was generated from the router in your own master bedroom. Your golden child wife, Monica, has been drowning in illegal gambling debt for 3 years, and she has been using my identity to hide it from you. The courtroom erupted. Monica bolted upright, her heavy wooden chair scraping violently against the polished floor. She pointed a trembling finger at me, her face contorted in sheer panic and desperate rage. She is a liar! Monica screamed, her voice echoing shrilly off the mahogany walls. She is a hacker. Caroline has always been violently jealous of me. She fabricated these digital footprints to save herself because she knows she is an unfit mother. Terrence, do not listen to this lunatic. But Terrence was not listening to her. He was staring directly at the massive glowing screen above the judge bench. His eyes were wide, tracking the sequence of numbers I had highlighted in glaring red. He was a seasoned prosecutor. He understood digital evidence better than anyone in this building. He knew the specific static IP address of the router he had personally installed in his own Chestnut Hill mansion. The numbers on the screen matched his home network flawlessly. "Order in my courtroom!" Judge Harrison bellowed, bringing his heavy wooden gavel down with a deafening crack. "Mrs. Evans, these are incredibly severe accusations of identity theft and wire fraud. You better have the financial trails to back up this digital theory. I do not deal in theories, Your Honor. I deal in ledgers," I replied, my voice steady, cold, and entirely devoid of fear. I tapped the spacebar on my cracked laptop. The projector screen shifted instantly, splitting into 2 massive, brightly lit columns. The left side displayed the offshore casino accounts Monica had opened using my stolen social security number. The right side displayed the highly encrypted banking records of Richard's flagship commercial real estate firm, Vanguard Holdings. "Let us follow the money," I announced, turning slowly to face my father. Richard had gone entirely rigid. The arrogant, untouchable smirk he wore when he tried to lock me in that armored SUV was completely wiped away, replaced by the terrifying, bloodless pallor of a cornered criminal. Beatrice sat frozen in the gallery beside him. Her theatrical weeping abruptly halted, her mouth hanging slightly open in shock. I pointed to the left side of the screen. On October 12th of last year, a marker for $50,000 was issued by a gambling syndicate in Macau under the name Caroline Evans. Exactly 48 hours later, on October 14th, a wire transfer for $50,000 was initiated to pay off that exact marker. I hit another key, highlighting the right side of the screen in bright yellow. Now look at Vanguard Holdings. On October 14th, an emergency vendor payment of exactly $50,000 was authorized by the CEO. It was routed through a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands before landing securely in the Macau syndicate account. I scrolled down the screen rapidly, revealing dozens of identical matching transactions spanning 36 months. 80,000 on November 3rd, 120,000 on December 1st, 200,000 right before the new year. Every time a casino marker was paid off, a matching withdrawal came from Richard's supposedly bankrupt corporate account, I declared, making sure my voice carried to every corner of the silent room. You are using my name to launder your failing company debt, Dad. I walked slowly toward the plaintiff table, stopping just a few feet from my father. You are not just going bankrupt because of the changing commercial real estate market. You are intentionally bleeding your own company dry to pay off your golden child massive illegal gambling debts. But you could not risk the SEC or your investors tracing those syndicate payments back to Vanguard Holdings. And you certainly could not let Terrence find out his perfect high society wife was a degenerate gambler. I swept my gaze over Monica, who was now hyperventilating, gripping the edge of the heavy table to keep her knees from buckling. So you used the family scapegoat, I continued. You stole my social security number, forged my signature on digital documents, and used my identity to absorb the legal liability. You framed me for your own financial rot. This is highly inadmissible. Richard finally roared, leaping to his feet and slamming his fist on the table. She obtained these corporate records illegally. This is a gross violation of privacy and corporate espionage. I demand she be arrested immediately. I am a senior auditor for the firm that handles your primary creditor. Richard, I shot back smoothly. When your accounts went into default 3 weeks ago, my firm initiated a standard risk assessment. Every document on that screen was obtained entirely legally through a standard commercial audit. You were simply too arrogant to realize your own daughter would be the one assigned to review the ledger. The sound of heavy, measured breathing broke the tension. Terrence took a slow, deliberate step backward, physically distancing himself from his wife and his father-in-law. The pity that had clouded his eyes when he first looked at my bruised face was completely gone. In its place was the cold, calculating fury of an assistant district attorney who had just realized he had been played for an absolute fool. Caroline Terrence said, his voice dangerously low and remarkably calm. Do you have the raw data for these transactions? The routing numbers, the authorization signatures, the timestamp logs? I reached into my torn jacket pocket, retrieved a sleek silver flash drive, and tossed it across the aisle. Terrence caught it effortlessly in one hand. He did not look at the drive. He slowly turned his head to look down at Monica. She was trembling violently. Tears were streaming down her face, ruining her perfect, understated makeup. But these were not the fake, manipulative tears she had planned to shed over my supposed addiction. These were the tears of a woman who knew her entire life was about to burn to the ground. "Terrence, baby, please," Monica whimpered, reaching out to grab his tailored sleeve. "She is manipulating the numbers. You know me. I would never do this to you. I love you." Terrence stared down at her hand on his sleeve, his expression filled with absolute revulsion. He violently jerked his arm away, leaving Monica grasping at empty air. He recognized the sheer visceral panic in her eyes. It was the exact same panic he saw in the eyes of every guilty defendant he had ever cross-examined on the witness stand. The realization that his prestigious marriage, his flawless social standing, and his entire family dynamic was a meticulously constructed criminal fraud was visibly crashing over him. "Your Honor," Terrence addressed the judge, his voice echoing with cold, professional detachment. "As an officer of the court, I must formally request an immediate recess. I can no longer represent the plaintiffs in this custody matter due to an extreme and irreconcilable conflict of interest. Furthermore, I believe this court must contact the Financial Crimes Division immediately." Beatrice wailed loudly from the gallery, burying her face in her hands, her aristocratic facade entirely demolished. Richard stood paralyzed, staring at the financial records on the screen that effectively sealed his federal prison sentence. They thought the ambush was over. They thought their public humiliation, the loss of their granddaughter, and their impending arrest was the absolute worst punishment I could inflict upon them. But I remained standing in the center of the courtroom, my hands resting lightly on my laptop keyboard. I had spent 3 years quietly preparing for this exact day. I had not just come to protect Lily from a custody battle. I had come to scorch the earth and ensure these monsters never breathed free air again. Do not call the Financial Crimes Division just yet, Your Honor, I announced, cutting through the chaos. Because Monica gambling debt and my father money laundering are only the symptoms. We have not even discussed the disease. Terrence stopped dead in his tracks, turning slowly to face me. The judge lowered his gavel, his eyes locked onto my screen. My family stared at me in sheer terror, realizing they had absolutely no idea what I was about to unleash. Your Honor, this is an outrage! Beatrice shrieked, her voice shattering the stunned silence of the courtroom. Her designer pearls rattled against her chest as she pointed a shaking finger at me. She is illegally accessing private networks. She is grandstanding. I demand you hold her in contempt of court and have her removed instantly. Judge Harrison raised his gavel, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and absolute bewilderment. He opened his mouth to restore order, but I did not give him the chance. I completely ignored my mother's hysterical outburst. My fingers danced across the keyboard of my cracked laptop, closing the dual spreadsheets of the financial ledgers. I opened a new file directory. This was the contingency plan I had prayed I would never actually need to use. I warned you outside the courthouse, Monica, I said, my voice projecting loud and clear over Beatrice's continued wailing. I trace digital footprints for a living. You really thought I would not secure my own physical perimeter when I knew how desperate you and Dad were getting. I hit the enter key. The massive projector screen behind the judge's bench went black for a fraction of a second. Then a crystal-clear 4K resolution video flared to life, illuminating the entire courtroom. The timestamp in the bottom right corner glowed in stark white numbers. Today's date, 3:02 a.m. The camera angle was perfectly positioned, recording from the hidden motion-activated dashcam I had installed in the visor of my secondary vehicle, a small sedan parked directly behind my primary SUV in my home driveway. The streetlights from the cul-de-sac cast a cold, sharp glow over the concrete. The footage was entirely undeniable. A figure crept into the frame dressed in head-to-toe black. They moved with cautious, deliberate steps toward the rear tire of my SUV. For a terrifying moment, the figure kept their head bowed. But as they knelt beside the rear passenger door, they looked up to check their surroundings. The motion sensor floodlight above my garage triggered, snapping on with a brilliant flash of illumination. The stark white light completely exposed the intruder's face in ultra-high definition. It was Monica. A collective physical gasp sucked the air out of the courtroom. The gallery erupted into a frenzy of shocked whispers. On the massive screen, the silent recording captured Monica pulling a pair of heavy-duty yellow-handled wire cutters from her dark jacket. She dropped to her knees, her face grim and determined, and slid her body directly under the chassis of my SUV. The camera recorded her twisting upward, positioning the thick metal jaws of the tool around the primary brake line. With a vicious, deliberate squeeze of her hands, the thick, braided line snapped. She slid back out from under the car, wiped her hands on her dark jeans, and sprinted away into the shadows of the neighborhood. The video looped, starting over again from the moment she crept onto my property. The courtroom exploded into absolute chaos. Judge Harrison was slamming his heavy wooden gavel repeatedly against his desk, roaring for order. But his commands were completely drowned out by the pandemonium. Bailiffs rushed down the center aisle, their hands resting on their utility belts, positioning themselves strategically around the plaintiff's table. Richard fell backward into his leather chair, his face entirely devoid of blood. He looked like a corpse. Beatrice had stopped screaming. She was staring at the giant screen, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly, unable to process the irrefutable evidence of her golden child committing premeditated attempted murder. But it was Terrence's reaction that commanded the space. The brilliant, fiercely principled assistant district attorney stood frozen, his eyes locked onto the looping video of his wife sabotaging my vehicle. The vehicle he knew I used every single morning to drive my 8-year-old daughter to school. He slowly turned his head to look at Monica. Terrence backed away from her. He did not just take a step. He physically recoiled, stumbling backward against the wooden railing that separated the gallery from the court floor. He looked at the woman he shared a bed with as if she were a venomous snake preparing to strike. The betrayal, the disgust, and the horrifying realization that he had unknowingly acted as the legal attack dog for a sociopathic murderer radiated from every line on his face. "No," Monica screamed, her voice shrill and desperate, cutting through the heavy noise of the courtroom. She leaped out of her chair, reaching her hands out toward Terrence, but he immediately stepped further away, holding his palms up to block her. "Do not touch me," Terrence warned, his voice a low, dangerous growl that shook with suppressed fury. "Do not even look at me." Monica spun wildly, facing the judge, then the gallery, pointing a manic, trembling finger at the projection screen. "It is a fake," she shrieked, her voice cracking in pure hysteria. "She is a hacker. She manipulated the video. It is AI. It is a deepfake. Caroline manufactured this entire video to frame me because she knows I am taking Lily away. I was in bed all night." "Terrence, tell them I was in bed." Terrence stared at her, his jaw tightly clenched. "You were not in bed, Monica," he said, his voice echoing in the sudden, stunned silence of the room. "You told me you were going to your mother's house last night to help her prepare for the hearing. You did not come home until 4 in the morning. Monica froze, the color draining from her cheeks as the last fragment of her alibi was completely annihilated by her own husband. She looked around the room, realizing she was entirely boxed in. There was no manipulative spin, no fake tears, and no high-priced legal defense that could save her from the undeniable reality playing on a loop above the judge's head. The stifling silence in the courtroom was broken only by Monica, frantic, shallow hyperventilating. She stood frozen at the plaintiff table, her hands hovering in the air, as if trying to physically push away the reality of her own actions playing out on the massive screen above. Terrence did not offer her a glance of comfort. He did not reach out to steady her. He simply turned his back on his weeping wife, his posture rigid with a cold, terrifying clarity. He slowly pivoted to face the gallery, locking his eyes directly onto Richard and Beatrice. "How long have you known?" Terrence demanded, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the lethal, precise authority of a prosecutor who had just caught a hostile witness in a devastating lie. Richard swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing visibly above his expensive silk tie. He tried to summon the commanding, untouchable CEO persona that had shielded him for decades. "Terrence, son, let us remain rational. We are all highly emotional right now. This is a private family matter that has spiraled out of proportion. We have the best defense attorneys on retainer. We can handle this quietly. Think of the scandal. Think of your career." "My career?" Terrence repeated, taking a slow, deliberate step toward the wooden railing that separated the gallery from the court floor. "You used my home network to commit federal wire fraud. You funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars to illegal offshore syndicates. And now I am looking at a video of my wife attempting to murder her own sister to cover your tracks. Answer the question, Richard. Did you order the hit on your own daughter to protect your portfolio?" Beatrice could not tolerate the insubordination. For 30 years she had been the undisputed matriarch, the puppet master who controlled the narrative, the finances, and the absolute obedience of everyone in her orbit. Seeing Terrence, a man she secretly viewed as the hired help, daring to interrogate her husband, shattered the last remaining fragments of her polite, wealthy facade. She shot up from her seat in the front row. The monogrammed silk handkerchief she had used to fake her grandmotherly tears fell to the floor, trampled beneath her designer heel. Her face, usually set in a mask of serene superiority, twisted into a snarl of pure, unadulterated venom. "How dare you speak to my husband in that tone?" Beatrice hissed, marching right up to the wooden divider. "Are you going to believe this dropout over us?" She thrust a perfectly manicured finger in my direction, her voice rising to a shrill, piercing pitch that bounced off the mahogany walls. "Caroline has always been a failure. A miserable, jealous little accountant who could never measure up to Monica. We gave you everything, Terrence. We plucked you out of your pathetic working-class life and gave you a seat at the table. You think you are actually one of us, Terrence. Terrence froze, the sheer toxicity of her words hitting him like a physical blow. He stared at the woman who had hosted him for 5 years of Thanksgiving dinners, suddenly seeing the absolute monster hiding beneath the cashmere and pearls. "You are nothing but an acquisition," Beatrice continued, completely losing control, oblivious to the court reporter, whose fingers were flying across the stenograph, capturing every single damning word. "We only let you marry Monica because your ADA title bought this family credibility. You are just a pawn. A useful idiot to keep the district attorney office away from Vanguard Holdings. Do not bite the hand that feeds you, because I will personally ensure you never practice law in this state again." A collective gasp swept through the remaining gallery members. Judge Harrison sat paralyzed behind his bench, his gavel resting uselessly in his hand, utterly stunned by the brazen public confession of a conspiracy to manipulate the justice system. I sat quietly at my table, my hands resting lightly on my laptop. I did not need to say a single word. Beatrice, in her arrogant, narcissistic rage, was handing me the victory on a silver platter. She was detonating the explosive charges I had carefully placed around the foundation of their lives. Terrence slowly turned his head to look at Monica. His wife stood entirely silent. She was staring at the floor, offering no defense of her husband, no denial of her mother's vicious tirade. Her silence confirmed every single word. Their courtship, their lavish wedding, their 5 years of marriage, it had all been a meticulously calculated transaction to purchase legal armor for a family of criminals. The heartbreak in Terrence's eyes vanished, replaced instantly by the hardened, impenetrable resolve of a man who had just watched his entire reality burn to ash. He reached up to his tailored suit jacket. With steady, deliberate fingers, he unclipped his official assistant district attorney badge from his lapel. He dropped his thick leather briefcase and his legal files onto the plaintiff table with a heavy final thud. He did not look at Monica again. He turned his back on the family that had bought him and walked across the center aisle of the courtroom. His footsteps echoed like gunshots in the dead silence of the room. He stopped right next to my table, physically and professionally, severing himself from the Evans family empire. He looked up at the judge, his posture perfectly straight, his voice ringing with absolute unwavering conviction. "Your Honor, I would like to formally withdraw as counsel for the plaintiffs and request immediate police intervention." Judge Harrison's face turned a mottled crimson. He raised his heavy gavel, his eyes darting from the discarded ADA badge on the table to the terrified faces of Richard and Monica. The air in the courtroom crackled with impending doom. He opened his mouth, clearly preparing to order the bailiffs to lock down the room and detain the plaintiffs. Before the gavel could strike the sound block, Beatrice let out a piercing, unearthly shriek. It was not a cry of legal defeat. It was a primal, desperate sound designed to completely hijack the room. She clutched her pearl-draped chest with both hands, her eyes rolling back into her head. She collapsed inward, her knees buckling as she hit the polished hardwood floor with a heavy, ungraceful thud. Mom Monica screamed, dropping to the floor beside her. Richard was instantly on his knees, tearing at the collar of Beatrice's silk blouse, bellowing for someone to call an ambulance. The entire dynamic of the courtroom inverted in a matter of seconds. The bailiffs who had been advancing to detain Monica and Richard for federal fraud and attempted murder immediately switched protocols. They became first responders, sprinting down the aisle while speaking rapidly into their shoulder-mounted radios. I did not move. I sat perfectly still beside Terrence, wrapping my arm protectively around Lily, watching the theatrical masterpiece unfold before me. I lived in the world of forensic auditing, where timing was everything. Beatrice's collapse was not a medical emergency. It was a perfectly executed tactical retreat. She saw the judge preparing the arrest mandate. She saw her own son-in-law defect to my side of the aisle. She knew the only way to stop the relentless grinding gears of the justice system was to introduce a life-or-death distraction. Judge Harrison stood up abruptly, his gavel suspended in midair. The legal momentum I had spent years meticulously building was suddenly frozen by a fabricated cardiac event. "Court is in emergency recess," the judge barked, pointing at his clerk to stop the official record. Clear the aisles for the medical personnel. Nobody leaves this building until the authorities have sorted this out. But the command was useless against the overwhelming chaos of a medical evacuation. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom burst open. Paramedics rushed in with a wheeled stretcher, their heavy boots pounding against the floor. They pushed Monica aside immediately, attaching monitors and an oxygen mask to Beatrice's face. She played her role with absolute terrifying brilliance. Her breathing was shallow, her eyelids fluttered wildly, and her hand weakly gripped Richard's forearm as if she were slipping away. Terence stood rigidly beside me, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle ticked in his cheek. He recognized the play just as clearly as I did. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket, his fingers flying across the screen, as he began furiously drafting messages to his former colleagues in the Financial Crimes Division. He was bypassing the local precinct, entirely going straight to the federal investigators he knew would not be swayed by a well-timed fainting spell. They lifted Beatrice onto the stretcher, locking the heavy wheels into place with a sharp metallic clack. Monica trailed behind them, weeping hysterically, clinging to the side of the gurney. She was playing the traumatized daughter to absolute perfection, using the medical emergency as a physical shield to walk right out of a courtroom where she had just been exposed as a violent criminal. Richard stood up slowly, smoothing the wrinkles from his tailored suit jacket. He looked down at his wife as she was rolled away, his face set in a mask of grave husbandly concern. He adjusted his cuffs, taking a deep breath before turning to follow the paramedics down the center aisle. To reach the exit, Richard had to walk directly past the defense table where I stood. I was closing my laptop, my eyes fixed firmly on my father as he approached. I expected a glare of pure hatred. I expected him to avert his eyes in shame now that his entire fraudulent empire had been exposed to the court. I did not expect him to stop. Richard paused right beside my shoulder. The panicked, cornered expression he had worn just 5 minutes ago when I displayed Vanguard Holdings bank records was completely gone. As the chaotic noise of the courtroom swirled around us with bailiffs shouting instructions and the judge speaking rapidly to his clerk, Richard leaned in. His mouth hovered just inches from my ear. His voice was a soft, jagged whisper dripping with a venomous, absolute triumph that made the blood in my veins run cold. "Enjoy the video, sweetie," he murmured, his breath hot against my skin. "It was a brilliant show. Really top-tier theatrics. But you were too slow. We already forged your signature on the final release documents this morning while you were driving here. Lily. 10 million trust fund was wired out of the country an hour ago. You are broke." I tightened my grip on Lily's shoulders. The $10 million trust fund was not just money. It was the impenetrable fortress David had built to ensure our daughter would always be safe, protected from the exact financial predators my family had become. Richard knew that money was the only leverage I had left to secure a new life, far away from their toxic reach. He slowly pulled back his eyes, locking onto mine. There was no fatherly warmth, no regret for the destruction he had caused. There was only the cold, calculating stare of a corporate raider who had just successfully liquidated a hostile asset. He offered me a patronizing, entirely fake smile of sorrow for the benefit of the watching bailiffs, then turned and walked calmly out of the courtroom, following the stretcher into the hallway. The heavy wooden doors swung shut behind him, sealing the room in a stunned, vibrating silence. Terence lowered his phone, turning to look at me. "The police are on their way," Terence said, his voice steady, but laced with a new dark intensity. I stared at the closed doors, the chilling weight of my father whispered confessions settling into my bones. The digital evidence was secure. The attempted murder was on tape. But the war had just fundamentally shifted. They had not just tried to take my daughter and my freedom. They had successfully stolen our entire future. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom clicked shut, sealing the chaos behind us. The marble hallway was dead silent, a jarring contrast to the circus we had just escaped. I stood frozen, my hands gripping Lily's small shoulders so tightly my knuckles turned white. My breathing was shallow and rapid. Richard had executed the ultimate corporate raid on his own granddaughter. Terence stood a few feet away, staring blankly at the polished floor. The immaculate, commanding posture of the city's most feared assistant district attorney had completely collapsed. He looked like a man who had just survived a horrific car crash, only to realize he had been driving the vehicle that caused it. He slowly turned his head to look at me. His eyes traced the dark purple bruise blooming across my cheekbone, the dirt smeared into my torn jacket, and the terrified grip Lily had on my waist. "I am so sorry," Caroline Terrence said. His voice cracked heavy with a profound, sickening guilt. "I put white-collar criminals behind bars for a living. I interrogate liars every single day. And I went home to one every night for 5 years. I let them use me to destroy you. Apologies will not recover Lily's trust fund, Terrence." I replied, my voice hard and entirely focused on the immediate crisis. My father did not just whisper a threat. He gave me a status report. While I was dragging myself out of that burning house this morning, Richard was forging my signature on the final release authorizations. $10 million was wired offshore an hour ago. I have physical custody of my daughter, but I am legally and financially stripped to the bone. Terrence's jaw clenched. The shock in his eyes rapidly solidified into a dangerous, calculated fury. He was no longer the grieving, betrayed husband. The predator had awoken. Offshore wire transfers of that magnitude flag federal oversight algorithms. Terrence stated, his mind instantly shifting into prosecutor mode. Richard has the banking connections to expedite the process, but large international clearinghouses still require a mandatory holding period for sums over $5 million. The money is in transit. It has not vanished entirely yet. We have a window, but we cannot do this from here. Richard has fixers, private security, and judges on his payroll. This building is not safe for you or Lily. "Where do we go?" I asked, pulling Lily closer. "My house is a crime scene. My accounts are frozen." "You are coming with me," Terrence instructed, turning on his heel and marching down the corridor. We bypassed the main elevators and took the restricted staff stairwell down to the secured underground parking garage. Terrence loaded us into the back of his unmarked city vehicle. He bypassed the affluent gated communities of Chestnut Hill and drove deep into the city, navigating through a maze of narrow working-class streets. He finally pulled into the cracked concrete driveway of a modest single-story brick house. It was a neighborhood where people knew their neighbors, where outsiders were noticed instantly, and where wealth bought absolutely zero leverage. Terrence pounded on the faded wooden front door. A moment later, multiple heavy deadbolts clicked open. The woman who stood in the doorway was the exact opposite of Beatrice Evans. She wore a faded cardigan and practical orthopedics. Her hands were weathered from decades of hard labor, the hands of a single mother who had scrubbed floors to put her son through law school. But her eyes carried the exact same sharp, uncompromising intelligence as Terrence. "Mom," Terrence started, his voice uncharacteristically tense. "I need a secure location. This is Caroline and Lily." Mrs. Sterling did not ask for a lengthy explanation. She did not express theatrical shock or demand to know why the assistant district attorney was bringing a battered woman to her doorstep in the middle of a workday. She took one look at the dried blood on my forehead, the soot staining my clothes, and the terrified exhaustion radiating from my 8-year-old daughter. "Get inside right now," she commanded, her voice brokering no argument. She ushered us quickly into her warm, fragrant living room. The moment we crossed the threshold, Mrs. Sterling slammed the heavy door shut, driving 3 separate deadbolts into the reinforced steel frame. She pulled the thick curtains tightly shut, casting the room into a safe, secure twilight. She knelt down so she was at eye level with Lily, offering a gentle, reassuring smile that completely transformed her stern face. "You must be exhausted, little one," Mrs. Sterling said softly. "I have a fresh batch of chocolate chip cookies in the kitchen and a television with every cartoon channel imaginable. Why do you not come with me while the adults handle their boring paperwork?" Lily looked up at me for permission. I gave her a small, tight nod. As Mrs. Sterling led my daughter toward the safety of the kitchen, she paused, turning her head to look back at Terrence and me. Her expression was pure, unadulterated steel. "No one touches this child while she is under my roof," Mrs. Sterling stated, making it an absolute, undeniable fact. As soon as Lily was out of earshot, Terrence completely took over the small dining room. He pulled a heavy laptop from his briefcase, plugging it directly into his mother's router. He bypassed standard public networks, entirely utilizing his encrypted ADA credentials to tunnel directly into the Federal Financial Crimes Tracking System and the city emergency dispatch logs. I need to freeze the offshore routing numbers, Terrence muttered, his fingers flying aggressively across the keyboard. If I can flag the transaction as a verified product of identity theft, the clearinghouse will freeze the $10 million in escrow. But I need Richard's exact geographical location to execute an emergency federal warrant. He pulled up the city emergency medical dispatch interface, typing in the badge numbers of the paramedics who had just wheeled Beatrice out of the courthouse. She suffered a severe cardiac event, I said, leaning over his shoulder to look at the screen. They were supposed to transport her to the Boston General Critical Care Unit. Terrence stared at the glowing green text on the dispatch log. The rhythmic clicking of his keyboard stopped completely. Caroline Terrence said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. I am looking at the live GPS tracking data for the exact ambulance that picked up your mother. They are not at the hospital. He turned his laptop screen toward me, highlighting a blinking red dot on the digital map. They never checked into Boston General. The ambulance diverted its route 10 minutes after leaving the courthouse. They are currently sitting on the private tarmac of Logan International Airport, directly next to a fueled, unregistered Gulfstream jet. Beatrice did not have a heart attack. They are fleeing the country. Terrence stared at the glowing green text on the dispatch log. The rhythmic clicking of his keyboard stopped completely. They are at the airport. We missed them, Terrence muttered, slamming his fist onto the wooden table. They paid off the paramedic crew. The entire cardiac arrest was a diversion to get a police escort to the tarmac. No, I said, sliding my own laptop onto Mrs. Sterling's dining table. They are not gone yet. Look at the live feed from the tarmac camera. Terrence tapped a few keys, bypassing the airport security firewalls to bring up the Massport surveillance feed. The ambulance sat idling next to a sleek Gulfstream jet. The rear doors of the emergency vehicle were wide open. The back was completely empty. There were no pilots. There was no luggage. A decoy, Terrence stated, his eyes narrowing. They diverted the rig to Logan while they slipped away in a different vehicle. Let them run, I replied, booting up my system. They cannot survive without capital. The $10 million they stole from Lily is their golden parachute. If we catch the money, we catch Richard. I connected my machine to Terrence's secure network bridge. I opened the proprietary forensic software I had spent the last decade perfecting. It was a digital bloodhound designed specifically to sniff out encrypted offshore routing and shell company layers. I need your ADA clearance codes, I told him, not looking away from my screen. My software can follow the transaction, but I need you to punch through the banking privacy firewalls without triggering an institutional security lockout. Terrence did not hesitate. He leaned over and typed his highly classified credentials into my terminal. He was officially linking the district attorney's office to my rogue investigation. We were crossing every legal boundary in the book, and neither of us cared. Rows of complex data cascaded across my screen as the algorithm began tearing through Vanguard Holdings' corporate accounts. We watched the stolen $10 million split into 50 smaller transactions. The funds bounced off servers in Zurich, routed through the Caymans, and fractured again across shell companies in Cyprus. Richard thinks he is a ghost, I said, my eyes tracking the rapid streams of code. But my husband designed the core architecture of this tracking program. Terrence looked up from his secondary monitor. David built this. David was the best forensic accountant on the East Coast. I replied, my voice hard and steady. He is the reason Richard despised him. My family always treated David like he was beneath us, a middle-class numbers guy who was not fit to marry into the Evans empire. But that was just a cover. They hated him because he saw right through their polished facade. I typed a command to isolate the routing protocols, forcing the software to reassemble the fractured payments. 5 years ago, David started noticing discrepancies in Vanguard quarterly reports, I explained. The memory of my late husband gave me renewed strength. Richard claimed Vanguard was yielding consistent 12% returns in a down market. David ran the numbers. He realized there was no actual product. There were no real investments. Vanguard Holdings was a massive, sophisticated Ponzi scheme. The new investor capital was simply paying off the old shareholders. Terrence swore softly under his breath. If a Ponzi scheme of that magnitude collapses, it triggers federal prison sentences for the entire executive board. Exactly, I said. David confronted Richard. He demanded my father step down and liquidate the assets to return the money to the investors. 2 days later, David died in a freak car accident on a perfectly dry road. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the hum of the computer processors and the distant sound of cartoons playing in the living room where Lily sat safely with Mrs. Sterling. I could never prove they tampered with his brakes. I continued staring blankly at the screen. But David knew they would come for us. Before he died, he locked our entire net worth into an ironclad trust fund for Lily. He designed the security protocols himself. He knew Richard would eventually need that $10 million to prop up the failing scheme. And today, Terrence realized, when Beatrice saw the judge preparing to arrest them, they knew the scheme was dead. They pulled the ripcord. A sharp, high-pitched chime suddenly erupted from my laptop speakers. The decryption progress bar hit 100%. Got you, I whispered, leaning closer to the monitor. The money had successfully reached a secure offshore account in the Seychelles. But the transaction was not fully cleared. A transfer of that size required a secondary biometric approval from the primary account holder. Richard had to authorize the final deposit from a physical device. Look at the digital footprint of the final approval ping, I said, highlighting a string of IP coordinates. The authorization signal did not come from an airport. It did not come from a hospital. Terrence pulled the IP address into his tracking software Cross, referencing it with the city grid. The digital map zoomed in rapidly, bypassing the commercial districts and hovering over an elite, heavily guarded suburban enclave. That is the Oak Ridge Country Club. Terrence stated, his eyes narrowing in confusion. Richard's private estate is located on the 18th hole. He is not fleeing, I said, a sickening realization washing over me. He already has his passport and his private jet waiting, but he is not leaving yet. Terrence hacked directly into the Oak Ridge Country Club event registry, bringing up the venue schedule for the evening. Tonight is the annual Vanguard Holdings Shareholder Gala, Terrence read aloud. Richard is hosting a massive party. He has 200 of the city's wealthiest investors arriving in 3 hours. He was throwing a party. While his wife faked a heart attack, while his daughter evaded federal fraud charges, and while he ruthlessly stole his granddaughter's entire future, Richard Evans was putting on a tuxedo to drink champagne with the very people he was actively robbing. He was going to stand in front of his shareholders, maintain the illusion of massive wealth, and then quietly slip away to the airport before midnight, leaving them all financially ruined. I looked at Terrence. He slowly closed his laptop. The raw, unfiltered anger radiating from him perfectly mirrored my own. We are not waiting for the police, Terrence said, his voice deadly quiet. We are going to that party. We left Lily safely tucked under a heavy quilt on Mrs. Sterling's sofa, her eyes glued to a bright cartoon on the television. The drive from the gritty working-class neighborhood to the manicured billionaire enclave of the Oak Ridge Country Club took less than 20 minutes, but the silence inside Terrence's unmarked city vehicle felt like a tightly coiled spring. The transition between the two worlds was jarring. We were crossing the exact socioeconomic boundary that my family had spent decades exploiting, moving from the reality of hard, honest labor into an insulated fortress built entirely on stolen wealth. The towering wrought iron gates of the Oak Ridge community loomed ahead, flanked by private security contractors in tactical gear. 2 guards stepped out of the brightly lit booth, holding up their hands to stop Terrence's vehicle. Terrence did not roll down his window to negotiate. He did not slow down. He drove the car right up to the barricade, slamming the transmission into park. He grabbed his gold assistant district attorney's shield from the dashboard and pressed it flat against the driver's side glass. The lead guard hesitated, squinting at the badge through the glare of the headlights. Terrence did not wait for clearance. He hit his emergency sirens for a single, deafening blast that shattered the quiet suburban night. The guards jumped back, scrambling to hit the release button. The heavy gates swung open, and Terrence floored the accelerator. We tore up the winding, perfectly paved driveway, pulling to a violent halt directly on the pristine front lawn of Richard's sprawling colonial-style estate. Valet attendants in crisp uniforms shouted in protest, scrambling out of the way as the tires tore deep, muddy gashes into the manicured grass. The house was brilliantly illuminated. Warm, golden light spilled from the massive bay windows, casting long shadows across the portico. Classical music drifted out into the cold night air, mingling with the clinking of expensive crystal and the low, arrogant murmur of polite society. This was not a panicked retreat. It was a victory lap. As we marched up the wide stone steps, the sheer audacity of the scene settled into my bones. Richard and Beatrice were hosting a lavish secret dinner for the very shareholders they were actively defrauding. They were toasting to their escape-rubbing shoulders with the city elite funded entirely by the $10 million they had just stripped from an 8-year-old girl. It was the ultimate insult, a final arrogant display of power before they boarded their private jet and vanished. Two massive private security men in dark suits stepped in front of the grand mahogany entrance, crossing their arms to block our path. Terrence did not break his stride. He shoved his ADA badge directly into the chest of the larger guard, his voice cracking like a whip. Obstructing a federal investigation carries a mandatory 5-year minimum. Move, or you will be wearing handcuffs before the appetizers are cleared. The men faltered, stepping back just enough. I did not wait for an invitation. I slipped past them, my heart hammering against my ribs, and marched straight toward the formal dining room at the back of the foyer. I did not knock. I raised my heavy boot and kicked the tall double doors inward. The thick wood crashed violently against the interior walls, the sound echoing like a gunshot. The chamber was a breathtaking display of stolen opulence. Crystal chandeliers hung low over a massive banquet table, seating 50 of the city's wealthiest investors. Silver platters of imported caviar, truffles, and prime cuts of meat covered every available surface. The air smelled of expensive perfume and vintage wine, and sitting at the far end of the table, looking absolutely radiant in a custom emerald silk gown, was Beatrice. There were no paramedics, there was no oxygen mask, there was no sign of a cardiac arrest. The miraculous, instantaneous recovery from her courtroom collapse was completely seamless. She sat elegantly in a high-backed chair, holding a delicate crystal flute of champagne, laughing brightly at a joke Richard was telling the chief executive of a rival investment firm. The violent crash of the doors silenced the room instantly. 50 heads snapped in my direction. I stood in the threshold, bringing the reality of their crimes right into their pristine sanctuary. My clothes were still ruined from the house fire they had orchestrated. My cheekbone was heavily bruised and swollen. My posture radiated absolute, unapologetic hostility. The contrast between my battered state and their flawless, stolen luxury was a physical blow to the room. Monica was seated near the center of the lavish table. She turned locking eyes with me. The color drained from her face so rapidly she looked like a wax figure. Her mouth opened in a silent gasp, and the crystal champagne flute slipped straight through her manicured fingers. It hit the porcelain saucer below, shattering into dozens of razor-sharp fragments. The sharp, violent crack of the glass was the only sound in the dead, silent room. Beatrice's smile vanished. The aristocratic grandmotherly routine evaporated in a millisecond, instantly replaced by the vicious, calculating predator I had always known her to be. She did not feign illness. She did not pretend to be shocked by my appearance. She stood up, her emerald gown catching the chandelier light, and pointed a heavily jeweled finger directly at my chest. "Security!" Beatrice sneered, her voice carrying the shrill, entitled authority of a woman who believed she owned the world. "Remove this trespasser immediately. She is unstable and violently trespassing on private property." The guards from the hallway rushed in behind me, their heavy hands reaching out to grab my shoulders. Terrence stepped squarely into the doorway, physically blocking them. He planted his feet, his hand resting deliberately on his hip, just inches from his concealed holster. He stared down the security detail with the cold, dead eyes of a prosecutor ready to ruin lives. The guards froze, recognizing immediately that laying a hand on him would result in a federal assault charge. I did not flinch. I did not acknowledge the guards, the terrified investors, or my sister trembling in her chair. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Beatrice and Richard. I stepped over the threshold, the shards of Monica broken glass crunching under my boots, and walked straight down the center of the room, heading right up to the head of the table. The heavy silence of the dining room was absolute, broken only by the sharp, rhythmic crunch of my boots grinding the shattered crystal into the expensive Persian rug. 50 of the city's most powerful financial elites sat frozen in their high-backed mahogany chairs. These were the titans of industry, the hedge fund managers, the venture capitalists who had trusted Vanguard Holdings with their millions. They stared at me with wide eyes, completely paralyzed by the sudden violent intrusion. I did not look at a single one of them. My gaze was anchored entirely on the head of the table. Beatrice sat rigidly, her emerald silk gown suddenly looking like a costume rather than armor. The miraculous recovery from her courtroom cardiac arrest was now undeniably exposed to anyone paying attention. Next to her, Richard gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles bone white, as he desperately tried to calculate a way to salvage his carefully constructed victory dinner. But it was Monica who broke first. She stepped out from her chair, blocking my path to our parents. She smoothed the front of her pristine ivory designer gown, her face twisting into a familiar mask of arrogant disdain. Even now, with her crimes exposed to the district attorney and her entire life teetering on the edge of a federal indictment, she relied on the only weapon she had ever mastered. She tried to make me feel small. "Look at you," Monica sneered, her voice carrying the shrill, theatrical tone she used to command attention at country club mixers. "You look like you crawled out of a dumpster. Are you really still wearing cheap clothes and throwing tantrums, Caroline? You are a complete embarrassment. You do not belong here." Her words hung in the air, a desperate attempt to frame me as the unstable, jealous sister making a scene. I felt the eyes of the wealthy guests, shifting their initial shock morphing into uncomfortable judgment as they took in my soot-stained jacket and the dark bruise on my cheek. This was exactly how my family had always operated. They relied on presentation to mask their poison. I did not flinch. I stopped 2 feet away from her, standing perfectly straight. "At least I'm not wearing a dress bought with money stolen from an 8-year-old, I said. I kept my voice perfectly level, but the volume was calibrated to reach every single corner of the cavernous room. Monica recoiled as if she had been slapped. The smug superiority vanished from her face, instantly replaced by raw panic. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, forcing her to step back. "Tell me." I continued, my eyes locking onto hers with absolute precision. "How is that rehab going, Monica?" A collective gasp rippled through the seated guests. The clinking of silverware stopped completely. In their elite, carefully curated social circles, acknowledging a stint in a rehabilitation facility was the ultimate taboo. But I was not finished. Because Terrence filed for divorce an hour ago, I stated, delivering the final devastating blow. Monica's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked wildly toward the double doors, searching for the husband she had used as a legal shield for 5 years. Right on cue, Terrence stepped out of the shadows of the hallway and into the bright, sparkling light of the crystal chandeliers. He did not look like the accommodating son-in-law who obediently attended their lavish family dinners. He looked like the apex predator of the city justice system. His suit jacket was unbuttoned, his tie pulled loose, and the gold assistant district attorney badge was clipped prominently to his belt, flashing under the lights. "The papers have been filed," Terrence said. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone that commanded instant, undeniable authority. "And that is just the beginning of your legal problems, Monica." The dining room erupted into a chaotic symphony of frantic murmurs. The socialites and investors began whispering furiously to one another, leaning across the table with wide, panicked eyes. They were witnessing the public implosion of the Evans family dynasty, and the sudden presence of a high-ranking prosecutor confirming the scandal sent a shockwave of terror through the room. These people were not fools. They recognized that when the assistant district attorney personally escorts a battered woman into a shareholder dinner to announce a divorce, massive criminal charges are imminent. Richard realized he was losing control of the room. The men and women sitting at his table represented hundreds of millions of dollars in investment capital, the very lifeblood of his fraudulent empire. If they panicked, if they demanded their money back tomorrow morning, the Vanguard Ponzi scheme would collapse before he could even reach the airport. He pushed his chair back violently, the heavy wood scraping loudly against the floor. He stepped around Beatrice and marched directly toward me, puffing out his chest to use his physical size as intimidation. He threw his arms open, forcing a booming, patronizing laugh that echoed uncomfortably against the high ceilings. "Ladies and gentlemen, please," Richard announced, projecting his voice over the rising panic. "I apologize for this unpleasant interruption. My daughter Caroline has been struggling with severe mental health issues for years. She recently suffered a tragic incident at her home, and clearly the trauma has triggered a psychotic break. She is completely delusional." He turned to face me, dropping the jovial facade. His eyes were cold, dead, and filled with a lethal promise. "Security, get this unstable woman out of my house before she hurts herself or someone else," Richard commanded loudly. Then he leaned in close, dipping his head so only I could hear his next words. "You have lost Caroline," he whispered, his breath carrying the sharp scent of expensive scotch. "The money is gone. You have no proof. Leave now, or I swear to God I will have you committed to a psychiatric ward for the rest of your natural life, and I will take permanent custody of Lily by tomorrow morning." He stood back up, expecting me to crumble. He expected the threat of losing my daughter to shatter my resolve, just as it always had in the past. He expected the presence of his wealthy friends to intimidate me into a humiliating retreat. I did not break eye contact. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached into the pocket of my ruined jacket. My fingers curled around the cold, solid metal of the device I had retrieved from David's hidden safe. I pulled my hand out and held up a small silver flash drive. It caught the light of the chandeliers, gleaming like a tiny metallic weapon in the center of the grand dining room. Richard's eyes locked onto it, and the arrogant, triumphant sneer completely melted off his face. I stepped directly around Richard. He lunged forward, raising his heavy hand to grab my wrist, but Terrence was faster. Terrence stepped squarely into Richard's path, his hand resting definitively on his leather duty belt. Richard froze, his eyes darting from Terrence to the heavy mahogany doors, where his private security guard stood utterly useless against a federal prosecutor. I kept walking until I reached the massive 80-inch smart TV mounted on the wall directly behind the head of the banquet table. It had been playing a silent, looping slideshow of Vanguard Holdings' philanthropic achievements, a pathetic digital monument to their fake generosity and manufactured public image. I reached up and shoved the silver flash drive directly into the side port of the television. The screen went completely black for 2 agonizing seconds. The entire dining room held its collective breath. Then the screen flickered to life. The philanthropic slideshow vanished. In its place, a cascade of heavily encrypted forensic accounting files flooded the massive display. These were David's final files. The documents my husband had sacrificed his life to compile. Red highlighted text glared under the crystal chandeliers. Bank routing numbers, wire transfer logs, and highly classified internal memos from Vanguard Holdings were displayed for every single elite investor in the room to see. The files systematically outlined exactly how investor capital had been siphoned out of legitimate domestic accounts and funneled directly into dummy shell companies located in Cyprus, Zurich, and the Caymans. A loud collective murmur rose from the banquet table. A man in a tailored tuxedo near the front stood up so fast his chair tipped over backward and crashed onto the polished wooden floor. He pointed a trembling finger at the glowing screen. He had just recognized his own private account number listed under a column clearly labeled liquidated assets. I turned to face my father. He was staring at the screen, his chest heaving under his custom tuxedo. The illusion of his absolute control finally shattering in front of the city's most powerful people. "You all hated David?" I said, my voice cutting through the rising panic of the 50 billionaires in the room. I made sure every word was sharp, loud, and undeniable. "You hated my husband because he was a self-made man. He built his wealth with his own 2 hands, with his brilliant mind, and with a level of integrity this family could not even comprehend. When he married me, you expected him to fall in line. You expected him to be another pawn. You expected him to dump his hard-earned capital into Vanguard Holdings like every other wealthy fool sitting in this room." Beatrice opened her mouth to speak, but she had absolutely nothing to say. Her emerald gown suddenly looked absurd against the backdrop of her exposed financial crimes. David refused to invest a single dime into your fraudulent shell companies. I continued pacing slowly at the head of the table, making eye contact with the horrified investors. He saw right through your polished country club facade. He realized Vanguard was producing phantom yields to cover massive systemic losses. He knew you were running a Ponzi scheme, Richard. He confronted you, and he told you he was going to the federal authorities. 2 days later, his car inexplicably malfunctioned on a perfectly dry highway. The silence in the room shifted from shock to absolute terror. The investors were no longer looking at Richard with admiration or respect. They were looking at a cornered murderer who had systematically stolen their family fortunes. "You destroyed a good man to protect your fake empire," I stated, pointing directly at Richard. "And when your scheme finally collapsed today, when Beatrice faked a cardiac arrest in court because you knew the federal indictments were coming, you pulled the ripcord. You did not just steal from these investors. You went into your own granddaughter's trust fund. You forged my signature while my house was burning to the ground. You are sitting here right now drinking vintage champagne and eating imported caviar, celebrating your escape with the $10 million David specifically left to protect his 8-year-old daughter." The chief executive of a rival investment firm, the man Richard had been laughing with just moments ago, slammed his fist onto the table. The heavy silver cutlery rattled violently against the porcelain plates. He looked at Richard with pure disgust. "Is this true?" Richard the executive demanded, his voice shaking with a dangerous fury. "Did you drain our capital to fund your escape?" Richard looked around the room. He saw the furious, betrayed faces of his elite social circle. He saw Terrence standing by the doors, a living embodiment of the criminal justice system, actively sanctioning this confrontation. He saw me standing strong and unbroken, wielding the exact weapon my late husband had forged for me to finish this war. For a brief, agonizing second, Richard looked like a defeated, broken old man. The reality of his absolute ruin seemed to crush his broad shoulders. But Richard Evans was a predator who had survived for decades by refusing to accept defeat. The momentary panic in his eyes suddenly hardened into something entirely different. His posture straightened. The color returned to his face. To the utter shock of everyone in the room, Richard threw his head back and let out a loud, booming laugh. The sound was entirely devoid of humor. It was a sociopathic, arrogant roar that echoed against the high ceilings and chilled the blood of everyone listening. He slowly applauded, clapping his hands together 3 times in a deliberately mocking gesture. "A spectacular performance," Caroline Richards sneered, walking slowly toward the center of the room. He addressed the panicked investors with the smooth, polished charisma of a master manipulator who had talked his way out of 1,000 tight corners. "My daughter has clearly paid someone to fabricate these digital documents. This is a pathetic, desperate attempt to extort me during a tragic mental breakdown." He turned his cold, dead eyes back to me. The smile on his face was entirely malicious. "You want to claim I stole your daughter's trust fund?" Richard asked, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a lethal, undeniable confidence. "Prove it." He stepped closer, his physical presence dominating the space between us, entirely unbothered by the evidence glaring on the screen behind me. "You can flash all the fake spreadsheets you want on that television," Caroline Richards stated, spreading his arms wide. "But the reality is that you have absolutely nothing. You have no money. You have no power. You cannot recover a single cent. The funds are already in the Cayman Islands. They are hidden behind 5 layers of encrypted sovereign banking walls. That money is entirely untraceable, and it is gone forever." I looked at the man who had spent my entire life making me feel small, disposable, and weak. Richard stood at the center of the grand dining room, his chest puffed out in his tailored tuxedo, absolutely certain of his own invincibility. He actually believed he had won. He genuinely thought his sheer arrogance could outsmart the digital fortress my husband had built with his dying breaths. I did not scream. I did not throw a tantrum, as Monica had so predictably claimed I would. I did not even raise my voice. I simply held his gaze, allowing the silence in the room to stretch until the tension became physically suffocating. Then I reached into the pocket of my ruined jacket and pulled out my cell phone. Terrence stepped slightly to the side, crossing his arms over his chest, giving me the floor. The 50 billionaires seated around the banquet table watched in absolute paralyzed fascination. I unlocked my phone and opened the secure terminal interface David had coded specifically for this exact nightmare scenario. My thumb hovered over the screen. I looked up at Richard one last time, memorizing the final moment of his false triumph. I typed a 12-character override command and hit execute. Behind me, the massive 80-inch television screen flickered violently. The complex forensic accounting spreadsheets, the wire transfer logs, and the lists of dummy shell companies instantly vanished into blackness. A collective gasp rippled through the dining room as the screen illuminated once again. But it was no longer displaying banking documents. A stark, towering image filled the entire display. It was the official, unmistakable seal of the United States Department of Justice, flanked by the emblem of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Below the seals, a thick, bright red banner pulsed with bold white text. Federal Seizure Notice. Assets frozen. Property of the United States government. The clinking of crystal and the rustle of silk gowns stopped entirely. The room was so quiet I could hear the sharp, shallow intake of breath from Beatrice at the head of the table. I turned my attention back to my father. The arrogant, booming laughter had completely died in his throat. The healthy, confident flush of his skin evaporated, leaving his face the color of wet ash. He stared at the massive federal seal looming over his dining table, his jaw slack, his mind desperately trying to comprehend the trap that had just snapped shut around his throat. "You really thought David would leave Lily Financial Security unguarded?" I asked, my voice echoing clearly against the high ceilings. "You think a forensic accountant of his caliber would not anticipate asset theft from his own father-in-law?" Richard opened his mouth, but only a dry, rattling sound came out. "David knew exactly who you were," Richard, I continued, taking a slow, measured step toward him. "He knew that the moment Vanguard Holdings started to bleed, you would view Lily Trust Fund as your personal emergency reserve. So he set a tripwire. He designed a protocol buried so deep inside the trust digital architecture that your highly paid corporate fixers could never detect it." I gestured to the glowing red banner on the screen. "When you forged my signature this morning, the system recognized the unauthorized breach," I explained, watching the absolute horror dawn in Richard's eyes. "It allowed your clearinghouse to process the transaction. It let you believe you had successfully authorized the offshore transfer. But the routing number you forced the money through was not a Cayman Islands offshore account." I paused, letting the reality of his ruin hang in the air. "It was a federal honeypot," I stated coldly. "It was a blind receiver account set up directly by the FBI Cyber Crimes Division. David coded the trust to automatically reroute any unauthorized bulk transfers straight into federal custody, instantly flagging the transaction as a hostile corporate theft." Pandemonium erupted at the banquet table. The elite investors, the men and women who had trusted Richard with their fortunes, suddenly realized the magnitude of the disaster. They were not just victims of a failing investment firm. They were sitting in the dining room of a man who had just triggered a massive federal investigation that would inevitably drag all of their personal finances into the light. The chief executive who had shouted earlier leapt to his feet, his chair crashing to the floor. "Lock the doors," the executive roared, pointing at Richard Private Security Detail. "Do not let him leave this room. He is going to drag us all down with him." The private guards hired to protect Richard from outsiders suddenly found themselves surrounded by 50 furious billionaires demanding their employer be detained. The loyalty bought by Richard's paycheck instantly dissolved in the face of federal prison time. The guards backed away from the doors, refusing to intervene. Beatrice clutched her chest, her carefully maintained aristocratic composure shattering completely. She grabbed Richard, her manicured nails digging into his tuxedo jacket. "Richard, do something!" Beatrice shrieked, her voice shrill and panicked. "Turn that screen off! Call the jet! We have to leave right now!" But Richard could not move. He was completely paralyzed, staring at the screen as if it were a physical monster coming to devour him. The realization of his absolute failure had short-circuited his predatory instincts. He had spent his entire life manipulating the system, buying off regulators, and bullying his family into submission. He had never faced a consequence he could not purchase his way out of. Terence stepped forward, his heavy boots crunching over the broken glass, stopping right beside me. He looked at the trembling, ruined patriarch of the Evans family with absolute disgust. The money is currently sitting in a secure Department of Justice escrow account. Terence announced to the room, his voice cutting through the panic of the investors. The moment that $10 million transfer hit the federal server, it triggered an automated warrant. The Financial Crimes Task Force is currently tearing apart the Vanguard Holdings corporate headquarters, and the FBI is seizing the runway at Logan Airport as we speak. There is no private jet waiting for you, Richard. There is no escape. Monica collapsed into her chair, burying her face in her hands. The reality of Terrence's divorce filing finally settled in. She was not escaping. She was tied to a sinking ship, permanently associated with the largest financial fraud in the history of the city, stripped of the legal protection her husband had provided. I looked down at Richard, the man who had mocked my grief, who had belittled my late husband, and who had tried to leave me and my daughter destitute just to save his own skin. He was trembling, completely broken, reduced to nothing but a terrified old man waiting for the authorities to arrive. "You did not just steal from me, Dad," I said, delivering the final fatal blow with absolute unwavering certainty. "You committed Class A wire fraud directly onto a federal server." The echo of the word federal hung in the air for a fraction of a second before the entire room descended into absolute madness. The pristine, suffocating elegance of the Vanguard Holdings dinner evaporated instantly. Men and women who controlled global markets, who dictated the financial futures of entire industries, were suddenly reduced to panicked animals trapped in a cage. Beatrice was the first of the Evans family to crack. The poised, untouchable matriarch turned on her husband with a ferocity that startled even me. Her manicured facade vanished, replaced by the raw, desperate terror of a woman realizing her entire social existence had just been incinerated. She stepped forward and struck Richard hard on the shoulder, her heavy diamond rings catching the chandelier light as her hand made impact. "You absolute fool!" Beatrice shrieked, her voice stripped of its cultured accent and grating against the high ceilings. "I told you to leave that trust fund alone. I told you David would have safeguards in place. Now you have dragged the Department of Justice directly to our doorstep. You have ruined us, Richard. You have ruined everything." Richard stumbled back from the force of his wife's physical blow, his face contorting with a volatile mix of terror and rage. He needed a scapegoat. He had spent his entire life avoiding accountability, and his predatory instincts demanded a target. His wild, bloodshot eyes landed on Monica, who was still slumped by her chair, shaking uncontrollably. "This is not my fault!" Richard roared, spit flying from his lips as he pointed an accusing finger at his eldest daughter. "You were the one managing the offshore routing protocols. You assured me the transfer architecture was scrubbed clean. You left a digital paper trail straight to a federal honeypot, you incompetent brat. You practically handed the FBI an engraved invitation to raid our private servers." Monica snapped her head up. Her perfectly applied makeup was now heavily streaked with black mascara, her eyes wide and manic. She leapt from her chair, pushing it backwards so violently it crashed into the mahogany wainscoting. "Do not you dare put this on me!" Monica screamed, her voice cracking into a hysterical, piercing pitch. "You gave the executive order. You authorized the signature forgery this morning. You are the chief executive officer. They are going to put you in a federal penitentiary for the rest of your miserable life, and I am not going down with you. I only did exactly what you told me to do." While my family tore each other apart, the reality of the situation fully registered with the 50 high society guests. These were people who survived and thrived by aggressively distancing themselves from failure, fraud, and scandal. Being in the identical room as Richard Evans when federal agents arrived would mean immediate subpoenas, forensic audits of their own firms, and relentless career-ending media scrutiny. A stampede began. The elite venture capitalists and hedge fund managers abandoned their expensive dinners and scrambled desperately toward the exits. Heavy wooden chairs crashed to the floor. Fine crystal goblets shattered, spilling vintage red wine across the Persian rugs like blood. Men in tailored tuxedos shoved past each other while women in couture gowns tripped over their own hemlines, clawing their way forward in a frantic, undignified bid to escape the contagion of the Evans family ruin. They surged toward the grand double doors at the back of the dining room. But Terence was already there. He stepped squarely into the center of the doorway, his broad shoulders blocking the exit. He reached behind him, grabbed the heavy brass handles of both doors, and pulled them shut with a definitive, echoing thud. He turned the deadbolt lock, the mechanical click sounding incredibly loud over the clamor of the panicked crowd. "Move out of the way," a prominent tech billionaire demanded, stepping up to Terence with false bravado, his face flushed with panic. "We have absolutely nothing to do with this fraud. You cannot hold us in here." Terence did not budge an inch. He stood with the unshakable, grounded authority of a man who held the full, uncompromising weight of the law behind him. "Nobody leaves," Terence stated, his deep baritone cutting through the chaos and forcing the room into a sudden, terrified silence. "Every person in this room is now a material witness to a federal crime. The financial documents displayed on that screen implicate several of your respective firms in Vanguard illegal shell operations. The authorities are already on their way, and nobody is walking out of these doors until the federal agents have collected your official statements and confiscated your mobile devices." A collective groan of utter despair rippled through the trapped guests. They backed away from Terence, their shoulders slumping, as they realized they were completely sealed inside the nightmare. I stood near the front of the room, watching the empire my father built completely implode. For the first time in my life, I felt no fear. I felt no lingering obligation to save them, no guilt for their destruction. The power dynamic had permanently shifted. They were finally facing the devastating consequences of their relentless, unapologetic greed. But as the room settled into a tense, suffocating murmur, I saw Monica out of the corner of my eye. The realization of her absolute destruction was washing over her in real time. In the span of a single hour, she had lost her fortune, her untouchable social standing, and her marriage. Terence had locked the doors, proving he was not just divorcing her, he was actively helping to prosecute her. The federal seizure notice burning on the television screen meant her assets were frozen. She was going to lose her freedom. She was going to lose everything that made her Monica Evans. The pristine, arrogant mask she had worn her entire life cracked, and then it shattered completely. A low, guttural sound escaped her throat, a ragged noise of pure desperation that did not even sound human. Her eyes darted wildly around the wreckage of the dining room. She was suffering a complete, violent psychological break. Her manic gaze locked onto a smashed champagne bottle resting on the edge of the mahogany banquet table, shattered during the guests' frantic rush for the doors. Before anyone could register what she was doing, Monica lunged forward. She grabbed a heavy, jagged piece of the broken green glass. Her knuckles turned bone white as she gripped the improvised weapon, the sharp edges pressing dangerously close to her own skin. She turned slowly, her chest heaving, her eyes dead and fixated directly on me. Monica let out a visceral, piercing shriek that sounded entirely inhuman. She lunged across the shattered crystal and spilled wine, the jagged neck of the champagne bottle raised like a crude dagger. Her eyes were completely unhinged, stripped of every ounce of sanity she had ever possessed. She was aiming directly for my face. I did not flinch. I did not even take a step back. I stood perfectly still, anchored by the absolute certainty that her reign of terror was over. Before she could cross the final few feet, Terence moved with blinding, practiced speed. He intercepted her trajectory, grabbing her wrist mid-air and twisting her arm forcefully behind her back. The sudden, violent momentum caused her to drop the weapon. The heavy green glass shattered against the hardwood floor, sending dangerous shards sliding across the Persian rug. Terence forced Monica down to her knees, pinning her securely. But he could not shut her mouth. Her psychological break was absolute, fueled by the terrifying realization that her life of luxury, privilege, and immunity was permanently extinguished. She thrashed wildly against her husband, gripped her expensive ivory gown, tearing at the shoulder, kicking and screaming like a feral animal trapped in a snare. "Let me go!" Monica howled, saliva flying from her lips as she struggled frantically. "I will kill you, Caroline. I will kill you right now." Terrence pressed his weight into her shoulder to keep her subdued. "Calm down, Monica," he commanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You are making this worse for yourself." But Monica could not hear him. Her mind had completely fractured. She locked her manic, bloodshot eyes onto mine, her face twisting into a mask of pure, concentrated hatred. She wanted to hurt me. She had lost her wealth, her freedom, and her social standing, so she resorted to the only weapon she had left. She weaponized the truth. "I should have cut your brake lines deeper," Monica screamed, her voice echoing violently off the mahogany walls and crystal chandeliers, just like Dad and I did to David Carr. The entire dining room stopped breathing. The chaotic murmur of the trapped investors died instantly. The silence that descended was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. Richard let out a guttural sound of pure panic. He lunged toward Monica, desperate to silence her, but a pair of venture capitalists who had been trying to flee suddenly grabbed his arms. They tackled him backward, slamming him hard against the banquet table. They were no longer protecting a billionaire CEO. They were restraining a confessed murderer. "Shut up, Monica," Richard roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple, the veins in his neck bulging against his tuxedo collar. "Shut your mouth right now." But Monica was completely detached from reality. She ignored our father entirely. She laughed. It was a high, grating, hysterical sound that chilled the blood of every single person in the room. "He would not give us the money," Monica shrieked, the ugly, horrifying truth vomiting out of her in a relentless wave. "David was going to ruin everything. He was going to expose the offshore accounts. He looked Dad right in the eye in his own office and said no. He said he was going to the authorities. So we made sure he never made it to the federal building. We made sure his brakes failed on that mountain pass. We watched him drive right off that cliff." I stood frozen. My lungs forgot how to process oxygen. For 3 agonizing years, I had carried the sickening suspicion that David Crash was not an accident. The police report had cited catastrophic mechanical failure. The insurance investigators had called it a tragic anomaly. My family had stood next to me at his funeral in their expensive black clothes, patting my shoulder and offering fake sympathetic tears. I had spent countless sleepless nights wondering if my grief was making me paranoid. Hearing it screamed aloud, hearing my own sister proudly admit to butchering the love of my life to protect her stolen wealth tore a hole straight through my chest. The agonizing validation washed over me, mixing with a fresh, overwhelming wave of grief for the man who had died trying to do the right thing. "It was so easy," Monica giggled, looking up at Terrence, who was staring down at his wife with a look of absolute horrifying revulsion. "Dad paid the mechanic to loosen the fluid line. I wiped the security footage at the garage. David thought he was so smart with his encryptions and his hidden ledgers, but he could not outsmart gravity. We won. We got his money." The 50 billionaires in the room were paralyzed with a primal terror. A minute ago, they were panicked about facing federal audits and losing their investment capital. Now they were trapped in a locked room with cold-blooded killers. In their elite, insulated world, white-collar crime was common. Embezzlement and tax evasion were dinner conversation. But brutal, premeditated homicide was an entirely different reality. A woman near the front row began to actively hyperventilate, clutching her diamond necklace as she backed away from Richard in sheer horror. Terrence reached to his belt and pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The metallic click echoed sharply in the silent room. He secured Monica's wrists tightly behind her back, locking the cuffs with a definitive snap. "Monica Evans," Terrence said. His voice was completely hollow, stripped of any affection or familiarity. "You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you start using it immediately." But Monica could not stop. She craned her neck to look back at me, a twisted, triumphant smile plastered across her tear-stained face. She wanted to deliver one final blow. "You were supposed to die too, Caroline," she stated, her voice dropping to a vicious, mocking whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. "Last week, Dad said the fire would look like an old electrical fault. He said you were getting too close to the truth and you had to go. You should have burned in that house. You should have died just like your husband." The final horrifying piece of the puzzle fell perfectly into place. Every instinct I had, every terrifying shadow I felt creeping around my life for the past 3 years, was entirely real. My father and my sister had slaughtered my husband to protect a Ponzi scheme, and they had tried to burn me alive in my sleep to finish the job. I looked down at Monica kneeling in the glass, and then I looked at Richard pinned against the table. They had taken everything from me, but tonight I was taking it all back. I stared down at the jagged green glass resting harmlessly on the Persian rug. I did not blink. I did not step back. I simply shifted my gaze from the shattered weapon to my sister, who was kneeling in the ruins of her expensive ivory gown, and then up to my father, who remained firmly pinned against the mahogany banquet table by his own panicked investors. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by Monica, heavy, frantic breathing, and the distant, rapidly approaching wail of police sirens echoing through the city streets. They had always believed their money made them untouchable. They thought burying the truth in offshore accounts and hiring expensive fixers would keep them safe forever. They were wrong. I knew, I said. My voice was a calm, steady blade slicing through the heavy, suffocating air of the dining room. I did not raise it. I did not need to. Every single person in the room was hanging on my every syllable. Richard's bloodshot eyes darted toward me, a flash of pure, terrified confusion breaking through his arrogant facade. I spent 3 years tracing the $50,000 cash withdrawal you made the day before David's crash. I continued walking slowly toward the head of the table. You thought drawing it from a secondary corporate account and routing it through a dummy shell company would bury the paper trail. But you forgot who you were dealing with. David taught me how to read the gaps in your financial ledgers. I found the missing capital. I tracked it to a shady auto shop in South Boston. Monica thrashed violently against Terrence's grip, but he held her securely in place, his face an impassive mask of judicial authority. We had the financial records, Terrence stated, his deep baritone reinforcing my words with the full weight of the district attorney office. We had the wire transfers and the offshore shell company blueprints. But white-collar crime is entirely different from homicide. A circumstantial cash withdrawal does not secure a murder conviction in front of a grand jury. I stopped directly in front of my father. He was sweating profusely, his expensive cologne completely overpowered by the sour stench of his own fear. He looked nothing like the untouchable titan of industry who had commanded this room an hour ago. He looked like a trapped animal. All I needed was the vocal confession to tie you to the mechanic you paid off, I said, looking down at my sister, then locking my eyes onto Richard. I needed you to admit it out loud. I needed you to feel so cornered, so desperate, and so incredibly arrogant that you would actually brag about killing a good man just to hurt me one last time. Beatrice let out a sharp, horrifying gasp. She backed away from the table, pressing herself flat against the patterned wallpaper, finally realizing the absolute finality of the trap we had set. Her hands shook violently as she stared at her husband and her eldest daughter, recognizing them as murderers for the first time. "You cannot use anything said in this room," Richard spat, his voice a desperate, gravelly whisper. "It is hearsay. It is the ranting of an unstable woman during a private dinner party. You have absolutely no proof she said those words. These investors will not testify for you. They will protect themselves." He looked wildly at the 50 billionaires surrounding him, silently pleading for their elite solidarity, begging for the code of silence that had protected their social circles for generations. Several of the venture capitalists shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my gaze. Richard was banking on their cowardice. He was banking on their absolute desire to avoid federal courtrooms and scandal. I did not need their testimony. I did not need a single person in this room to open their mouths. I smiled. It was the first genuine, unburdened smile I had worn in 3 agonizing years. It was cold, final, and completely merciless. I raised my right hand and pointed directly up at the ceiling. Hidden discreetly in the corner of the ornate crown molding, disguised perfectly among the intricate woodwork, a tiny, sleek camera lens blinked with a steady red light. Richard's eyes followed my finger, and all the remaining color drained entirely from his face. "You shouldn't have let Terrence install the smart home security system," I said, delivering the words with absolute surgical precision. Monica let out a strangled, sobbing gasp. Terrence had upgraded the estate security months ago under the guise of protecting their valuable art collection. Richard had welcomed the upgrade, praising his son-in-law for his thoroughness. He was completely oblivious to the fact that he was authorizing a federal surveillance operation inside his own fortress. It feeds directly to the cloud, I explained, dropping my hand and locking my eyes onto my father's horrified stare. And right now, to the DA's office. A fresh wave of terror swept through the elite guests. The investors suddenly realized they were not just witnesses. They were caught on a live federal wiretap attending a dinner funded by a massive criminal enterprise. The panic was immediate and absolute. Outside the high windows, the flashing red and blue lights of dozens of police cruisers illuminated the manicured front lawn, casting chaotic, rotating shadows across the dining room walls. The heavy oak double doors at the back of the room suddenly burst open. A tidal wave of dark tactical gear and windbreakers, emblazoned with bold yellow letters, flooded the elegant space. The sheer kinetic force of the breach shattered whatever remaining illusion of control the room held. Dozens of federal agents and armed local police swarmed the dining room, their heavy combat boots crushing the remnants of spilled caviar and shattered crystal into the expensive Persian rugs. The strobing red and blue lights from the armada of cruisers outside pulsed violently through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the terrified faces of the elite guests in alternating flashes of crimson and ice. "FBI, keep your hands exactly where we can see them!" The lead agent barked, his voice amplified and commanding. The 50 billionaires, politicians, and socialites who had paid thousands of dollars just to secure a seat at my father's table instantly complied. Men who commanded multinational corporations pressed themselves against the silk wallpaper, their hands raised in the air, their faces pale with profound, unprecedented fear. They were entirely powerless, stripped of their wealth and influence, in the blink of an eye, reduced to nothing more than bystanders in a massive federal raid. Terrence released his physical hold on Monica, stepping back smoothly as the tactical team formed a perimeter. He reached inside his tailored suit jacket, pulling out a slim leather folio. He flipped it open, the gold shield catching the harsh strobe lights filtering in from the lawn. "Ada Terrence Vance," he announced, his tone, dropping the facade of the obedient son-in-law and adopting the sharp, uncompromising authority of the district attorney office. "The premises are secured. The primary targets are ready for transport." The lead agent nodded, signaling his team forward. Terrence raised his hand, pointing directly at the mahogany banquet table where Richard was still being held down by his own former allies. "Richard Evans," Terrence stated loudly, ensuring the entire room heard the charges. "Conspiracy Class A, wire fraud and capital murder." Two heavily armored agents hauled the billionaire to his feet. Richard's face was a mask of furious indignity. He thrashed against their grip, his tailored tuxedo jacket ripping at the seam. "You cannot do this to me," Richard snarled, spit flying from his lips as he glared at the agents. "Do you know who I am? I will buy this entire department. I will have your badges by morning. You have no authorization to touch me." The federal agent did not even blink. He simply spun Richard around, slamming him face first against the polished wood paneling of his own dining room. The sharp metallic ratcheting of handcuffs being fastened around Richard's wrists echoed beautifully in the silent room. His arrogant protests were immediately drowned out as the agent began reciting his Miranda rights, the clinical practiced words sealing my father's fate. Across the room, another pair of agents approached Monica. They hauled her upright from the debris of the shattered champagne bottle. She was hyperventilating, her eyes darting between the armed officers and me. The reality of the handcuffs Terrence had already placed on her wrists finally seemed to penetrate her madness. "I told you the truth," Monica babbled frantically, her voice pitching into a hysterical whine as an officer grabbed her arm. "David made us do it. He was going to take the money. I am a victim here. You have to listen to me." The officer ignored her completely, reciting her rights over her pathetic, disjointed attempts to justify butchering my husband. She was frog-marched toward the exit, a broken, sobbing mess, stripped of every ounce of the unearned arrogance she had wielded like a weapon her entire life. The high society guests watched in absolute paralyzed horror as the pristine image of the Evans family was publicly and brutally dismantled right in front of them. Then the agents moved toward the head of the table. Beatrice had pressed herself entirely into the corner of the room, her aristocratic composure entirely obliterated. The untouchable matriarch of the Evans empire, the woman who had spent decades orchestrating the social destruction of anyone who dared cross her, was weeping openly. Her chest heaved as she watched her husband and eldest daughter being dragged away like common criminals. A female agent stepped up to Beatrice, grasping her arms and pulling them behind her back. The heavy steel cuffs clamped down mercilessly over her expensive diamond bracelets. Beatrice's eyes swept the room in a blind panic. She was searching desperately for a lifeline, looking for any of the powerful politicians or judges in the room to exert their influence and stop the nightmare. But the guests simply looked away, terrified of being associated with her. Her gaze finally landed on Terrence. He was standing beside the lead investigator, his posture relaxed, his expression carved from stone. "Terrence," Beatrice sobbed, her voice cracking into a desperate, wretched plea as she strained against the federal agent grip. "Terrence, please. You are family. You know us. Tell them to stop. Tell them this is a massive misunderstanding. Call the commissioner. Do something." Terrence slowly turned his head to look at his mother-in-law. He did not flinch. He did not show a single ounce of sympathy. He looked at the weeping, terrified woman with a level of absolute, unadulterated disgust that seemed to lower the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. He took a single, deliberate step toward her, ensuring every terrified billionaire still frozen in the room could hear exactly what he had to say. The physical struggle was pathetic to witness. Monica dug her expensive stiletto heels into the thick Persian rug, using her dead weight to resist the two federal agents hauling her toward the shattered dining room doors. Her mascara ran down her cheeks in dark, jagged rivers, staining her pale skin. She had always relied on her beauty and our father money to shield her from the consequences of her cruelty. Now stripped of both, she looked small, feral, and utterly terrified. "Caroline!" she screamed, her voice cracking as the agents hoisted her upright. "Caroline, please!" The sound of my name echoing in that cavernous, hostile room made the remaining guests flinch. Monica twisted her neck, locking her bloodshot eyes onto mine. The haughty, untouchable sister who had spent my entire life making me feel invisible was now begging for my attention. "You cannot let them do this to me," Monica sobbed, thrashing against the unyielding grip of the officers. "We are sisters, we share the same blood. You know I am fragile. I will not survive in a cell. Tell them to stop. Tell them it was a lie. David would not want you to do this to your own family." My jaw tightened at the sound of my husband's name on her lips. She had butchered him to protect her inheritance, and now she dared to use his memory as a shield. I did not raise my voice. I simply stepped forward, the heavy silence of the dining room amplifying the sharp click of my shoes against the hardwood floor. The federal agents paused, sensing the absolute finality of the moment, allowing me to close the distance. I stopped just inches from Monica. She was trembling violently, her breath reeking of expensive champagne and sour fear. I shifted my gaze past her locking eyes with Richard, who was being dragged forward by his captors. His face was purple with rage, a fresh, ugly bruise blooming on his cheek from where the agent had slammed him against the wainscoting. Beside him, Beatrice was practically hyperventilating, her diamond bracelets clinking a pathetic rhythm against the cold steel of her handcuffs. They were all gathered before me, the holy trinity of my torment, the architects of my suffering. "For 30 years you dictated every breath I took," I said, my voice resonating with a calm, surgical precision that cut through the flashing red and blue lights. "You isolated me. You mocked my ambitions. You murdered the only man who ever truly loved me because you thought my happiness was a threat to your empire." Richard bared his teeth, straining against the agents. "You ungrateful wretch!" He spat, his voice a venomous hiss. "I built you. I gave you everything. You are nothing without the Evans name." I smiled. It was a cold, hollow expression that finally extinguished the last remaining embers of Richard's arrogant fury. I am the one who tore the Evans name down to the studs, I corrected him softly. I looked at my mother. Beatrice could not even meet my eyes. She stared at the floor, weeping uncontrollably, as the elite socialites she had spent a lifetime impressing watched her total humiliation. There would be no more charity galas, no more magazine covers, only concrete walls and jumpsuits. You told me I would never leave this family alive, I said, my gaze sweeping over the three of them, committing their broken state to memory. You told me I was trapped, that your money and your power would always dictate my reality. Monica let out a wretched, suffocating gasp, shaking her head in frantic denial. You were wrong, I stated, delivering the final fatal blow. You are the ones who are dead to the world now. I did not wait for a response. I did not need to hear their excuses, their threats, or their pathetic pleas for a mercy they had never once shown me. I turned my back on them. The physical action felt like dropping a 1,000-pound weight from my shoulders. The air in the room instantly felt lighter, the suffocating atmosphere of the Evans estate breaking apart as I walked away. Terrence was waiting for me near the breached double doors. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, his gold district attorney badge catching the strobe lights from the armada of police cruisers outside. We did not exchange a word of celebration. The victory was too profound, too heavy for idle chatter. We simply exchanged a look of absolute unbreakable solidarity. We walked out together. Behind us, the chaos of the federal raid reached a fever pitch. The agents began marching my parents and my sister out toward the waiting transport vans. The 50 billionaires and politicians remained pinned against the dining room walls, their empires and reputations severely compromised by their mere presence at my father table. They were trapped in the wreckage of a dynasty that no longer existed. I stepped out onto the front portico. The crisp, cool night air hit my face, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. It was the cleanest breath of air I had taken in 3 years. Dozens of heavily armed officers swarmed the manicured lawns, securing the estate and establishing a massive crime scene perimeter. The flashing lights painted the grand ivory columns of my childhood prison in harsh, unforgiving colors. Terrence signaled to a waiting black town car. The driver immediately opened the rear door for us. I paused for one brief second, looking back at the sprawling, ostentatious mansion that had been the site of so much pain, so much manipulation, and so much bloodshed. It was no longer a fortress. It was a tomb. The toxic chapter of my life was permanently closed. I slid into the back seat of the car, looking forward into the dark, open road ahead. For the first time in my life, I was entirely free. 3 months later, the air tasted entirely different. The oppressive manufactured chill of the Evans estate had been replaced by the warm, pine-scented breeze rolling off the water. My new home sat at the end of a winding, heavily wooded private road, flanked by discreet but impenetrable security gates. High-resolution cameras were tucked seamlessly into the eaves of the house, and a reinforced steel perimeter enclosed the property. The lake house itself was a sanctuary of sweeping glass and natural cedar designed for light and air. It was completely devoid of the dark mahogany, the suffocating shadows, and the violent legacy of my past. I stood on the expansive back deck, the smooth wood warm beneath my bare feet, arranging silverware and heavy linen napkins on a long, rustic outdoor table. The afternoon sun cast a brilliant golden glow over the rippling surface of the lake, turning the water into a sheet of diamonds. There were no silent, terrified caterers here. No armed fixers watching my every move from the perimeter. Just the gentle hum of the wind rustling through the ancient oak trees and the rhythmic, comforting crackle of charcoal heating up on the grill nearby. A burst of genuine, uninhibited laughter echoed across the manicured lawn. I paused, resting my hands on the table, and watched my daughter Lily. She was darting between the tree trunks, her bright yellow sundress a blur of motion as she played a fierce, highly competitive game of tag with Terrence's 2 young children. Lily shrieked with pure joy, successfully dodging Terrence's eldest son before collapsing onto the soft, sun-baked grass in a fit of giggles. Seeing her like this, completely free from the suffocating, toxic shadow of her grandparents, was a victory far sweeter than any courtroom verdict. She would never know the cold, calculating cruelty of Beatrice. She would never be measured and weighed by Richard. She belonged to the light now. Terence stood at the edge of the stone patio, expertly flipping thick burgers on a massive stainless steel grill. He looked like a completely different man. The rigid, tightly wound prosecutor who had carefully navigated the treacherous waters of my family's criminal empire was gone. He wore a faded linen shirt rolled up at the elbows and canvas shorts. His posture relaxed, his shoulders finally unburdened. His divorce from Monica had been finalized with brutal, undeniable efficiency. Given the federal indictments, the mountain of unassailable evidence we had provided, and her own hysterical confession captured on federal wiretaps, he had secured full and absolute custody of his children without spending a single day in a family courtroom. The judge had signed the orders with grim finality, permanently severing Monica's legal rights. Terence caught me watching them and offered a warm, easy smile, raising his spatula in a silent, cheerful salute. He was no longer just an ally in a war. He and his children were the family I had actively chosen. We were survivors bound together by the fires we had walked through to get here, committed to building a life defined by peace instead of paranoia. I picked up a stack of ceramic plates and carried them toward the serving station. Beside the stack of fresh cedar coasters rested my tablet, its screen temporarily dark and silent. As I set the plates down, a soft chiming notification broke the quiet. The screen illuminated, flashing a breaking news alert from a major national network. I leaned forward slightly, my eyes scanning the bold black text scrolling across the high-definition display. Federal judge denies bail for prominent socialite family in landmark capital murder and wire fraud case. Defense attorneys cite flight risk concerns as trial date is set. The accompanying photograph showed Richard, Beatrice, and Monica being led out of a federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan. They were wearing identical bright orange jumpsuits, their wrists shackled to heavy waist chains, their ankles bound by iron cuffs. The arrogant, untouchable titans of industry were completely unrecognizable. Their faces were gaunt and pale, their expressions hollowed out by the terrifying reality of their permanent new existence. Monica looked utterly vacant, staring at the pavement. Beatrice was actively hiding her face behind her bound hands. Richard simply looked defeated, a broken man who finally understood that his checkbook could not unlock a federal holding cell. They were locked in cages of their own making, permanently stripped of their power, their assets seized, their reputations turned into a cautionary tale. They were entirely dead to the world they had once ruled with absolute impunity. I stared at the digital image for a long moment. I searched my chest for a surge of vindictive adrenaline, or a lingering spark of anger, or even a ghost of the old fear. There was nothing. There was just absolute, unshakable peace. I reached out and pressed the power button, plunging the screen into darkness and silencing their ghosts forever. Turning away from the digital noise, I picked up a heavy crystal decanter. I poured myself a generous glass of robust red wine, the deep ruby liquid catching the late afternoon light perfectly. Taking a slow, appreciative sip, I leaned against the cedar railing and looked back out over the vibrant, sprawling lawn. Lily was back on her feet, chasing Terence's daughter toward the water edge, her laughter ringing out clear and bright against the backdrop of the lake. Terence called out a playful warning about getting their shoes wet, chuckling warmly when the children completely ignored him and kept running. David would have loved this. He would have loved the tranquility, the simplicity, and the absolute freedom we had finally secured. He would have loved watching his daughter run without fear. I smiled, letting the warmth of the summer sun and the rich, complex taste of the wine settle deep into my bones. The war was officially over. The ultimate, absolute revenge was simply living beautifully. The core lesson from these tales of sweet revenge is that true vindication comes not from destroying others, but from reclaiming your self-worth. When faced with toxic family dynamics and relentless underestimation, the most powerful response is to silently build your own success. Toxic individuals thrive on your emotional reactions. Denying them that power strips away their influence entirely. By focusing on personal growth, healthy boundaries, and absolute independence, you transform past pain into an unassailable fortress. The ultimate sweetest revenge is simply living a beautiful life. Have you ever walked away from toxicity to forge your own path? Share your story in the comments below.